and thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm also thrilled to see how many of our students in Trondheim that are not only organizing but also presenting their work. It's great to see. And also, as you said, I'm in the final phase of my PhD. I've been working on that for, well, almost 5 years now. And on the side, I've also had the occasion to teach architectural history and also a little bit of studio. And when I started my PhD and started teaching, I would never even imagine that the stuff I was working on, like Baroque architectural theory, classical design, that this would be relevant for studio teaching. But then there was arkitekturopprøret, architectural rebellion came around, students started to be engaging with this stuff, and suddenly the stuff I was had been nerding with for 2 years became relevant for students that in their designs. So that was quite interesting to see. Today I want to give a little bit of a glimpse into the way I've been I think teaching history, not as a sort of museal finished chapter, dead history. When you engage with classical architecture, history suddenly becomes a very living thing. So I want to discuss two major subjects, beauty and composition, over a reasonably long period of time, from the Renaissance to Neoclassicism, to provide a broad sweep of early modern architectural history, though focusing on some very concrete examples. So I want to contemplate upon two, let's say, subjects or two problems that we discuss a lot among colleagues, among students. First pertains to aesthetic theory, how beauty has been explained earlier, and in what ways aesthetic theory might or might not affect architectural practice. So, trying to explain beauty is something that humans have always done. Very often they provide explanations that aren't that satisfactory. In my opinion, often it sort of seems to miss the point, especially when you work practically in a field such as architecture and try to achieve something beautiful. Very often aesthetic theories sort of seem irrelevant. But we'll get a little bit back to that. The other subject is the relationship between architectural morphology and syntax. And just to make it clear, when I use those two words, morphology pertains to single elements in the classical formal language. So, for instance, the capital of a column, or the base of a column, the parts of the entablature, and so on. Whereas syntax, just like in linguistics, it's the way you combine something. So composition is obviously not only about designing single elements, but also combining them together. And I want to sort of draw the attention to how the development of architectural composition was motivated by aesthetic concerns. And I think the story about the Renaissance, the Baroque and Neoclassicism is quite telling with respect to these problems. So, does this work? Okay. Yeah, so let's start in the Renaissance. What was the Renaissance about? Well, Renaissance was a lot of things, but for architects it was largely about restoring Roman architectural principles, which sounds easy, but it wasn't in any way, shape, or form. So at the core of Roman architecture were obviously the classical orders, the Doric, the Ionic, Corinthian, and so on, not only as load-bearing structural elements like we see in temples, but also as a kind of way to decorate facades without orders or columns being load-bearing. And also, of course, Romans designed magnificent interiors, also working with the classical orders. So I wanted to start with a quote by Leon Battista Alberti, who was the first modern architect to write a book about architecture. And he made a kind of interesting distinction, I think. He distinguished between beauty and ornament, saying that beauty is some inherent properties diffused all through the body of that which may be called beautiful, whereas ornament has the character of being like attached or additional, which is a bit, I think it's a bit counterintuitive. What's important to bear in mind is that beauty, for all, like Renaissance architect, also in antiquity, beauty in architecture, that is to say, beauty had to do with proportions, the relationship between parts. So when we talk about the relationship between parts, for instance, in this building, it's the masterpiece by Alberti in Mantua, a grand church. So he would say that beauty depends, or is the result of proportions, so depth, length, height, whereas ornament is just another property. So beauty is one property, ornament is another property. So you can have beautiful houses without ornament, you can also have ugly houses with ornament. It's a bit counterintuitive, but the way they relate to each other is that ornaments can either enhance beauty or compensate for flaws. So the interesting thing I think about this is that he made a distinction between ornament, which means the classical orders, right? The columns, the entablatures, and beauty as something pertaining to what is called as the essence of the building, its proportions. And of course, Romans also emphasized proportions in architecture, such as what we see in the Vitruvian Man. And the idea is that beauty is said to relate to commensurability of quantities. So proportions is the relationship between two quantities, and Vitruvius famously said that temples should be designed with the same commensurability or symmetry as the body of a sort of well-shaped human being. And that's what this drawing represents. And these theories of proportion became more and more elaborate during the Renaissance. So around the middle of the 1500s, there was this tendency to associate architecture with the great theory of the harmony of the spheres. You might have heard of it. It's this before the scientific revolution, there was this grand theory that everything in the universe was sort of based on these simple ratios. And these ratios become audible if you employ them in musical instruments. So on top here you see these basic ratios representing musical intervals on the scale. And these were seen as somehow constituent of the entire universe. So this diagram shows the correspondence between the octave and the intervals of the octave and the celestial bodies revolving around Earth, and so on and so forth. And it was associated with the virtues of humans, the 9 muses, and so on. And when architects try to explain what beauty is, and since beauty in architecture obviously had something to do with proportions, they associated architectural proportion with harmonic proportion. And Palladio is the most famous example of an architect actually employing these proportions in architecture. Still, Palladio did a lot more than that. His companion, Daniele Barbaro, said that which is consonant to the ears is also beauty to the eyes. So the theory here is that there are these immutable proportions of nature. When you use them in architecture, it makes it beautiful. But it doesn't take into account the classical orders. So that's what I find interesting with these early modern theories of aesthetics. And in modern times, one of the famous interpretations of all this is that Renaissance architects were not free to apply a system of ratios of his own choosing. This is Rudolf Wittkower, a very influential modern historian. So he stated that the ratios had to comply with conceptions of a higher order. And okay, so you find proof of this in like main volumes of buildings, depth, width, height, and so on in Palladio's buildings and some other buildings. But he has been criticized for not really considering ornamentation, decoration, the classical orders. So a kind of alternative, almost, story of the Renaissance, contrarily to Wittkower, transpires if you consider its application of the classical ornament, classical orders. This is considered the first Renaissance building. It's not significant in the sense that it's a new kind of building typology. It's significant in the sense that it very faithfully replicates Roman ornaments, classical orders, as we call them. So it's a longitudinal building with a loggia and a gateway and so on. But what makes it Renaissance and not medieval is its imitation of morphology, so single elements again. So this is before syntax becomes a sort of, let's say, important part of the attempt to restore Roman architectural principles. I think the Ionic order actually tells this story the best, like the story of restoring the classical formal language of architecture. So to the left we see a Roman prototype, and then we see over about 1 century various attempts to design an Ionic capital. And as we can see, it's kind of crude at the beginning, and then it becomes a little bit better, and then like 1.5 centuries into the period that we call the Renaissance, Palladio and others managed to basically imitate the proportions of the capital itself. And around the same time, a contemporary of Palladio, Vignola, published the most influential architectural book ever, which was a very short manual that has been republished more than once a year, I think, since it was published first. Everyone cited Vignola in the subsequent generations. We also use it when students do their initial assignments, when they start out learning about the classical design. So it was a long process of basically restoring these morphological elements. That's like one side of it. And we might ask, when Vignola sort of did it, he provided an account that was so applicable and comprehensive that everyone just started using it. Was the mission completed? For instance, architects, did they think that, like, now we've restored classical architecture, so what's next? I guess that's the question. And Borromini, this is a quote by Borromini, one of the major pioneers of the Baroque. He was quite clear that he would not pursue the profession of architecture with the sole purpose of being a mere copyist. So that's a quite interesting quote. And it reflects this background of trying to imitate, trying to copy, trying to restore. But he was much more interested in being creative and experimental and so on, as his buildings clearly testify. One of his most famous works, it's a classical building. It employs the classical morphology, though it's altered, it's sort of played with, it looks a bit different, and it's put together in a composition that does not look very much like Roman precedents. And this is more like, when we talk about Baroque, this issue of syntax gets really important. And I want to show one example of what we mean by architectural syntax by discussing the way you do the crossing of a cruciform church like the one we see here. Because in Roman times, religious sacred architecture employed the orders in the facades because you were not supposed to enter the temple. You made your offering outside, whereas in Christian times, people were supposed to assemble on the inside, so the interior becomes very important. And the classical orders were, of course, very important for how these spaces were designed on the inside. And the major issue, which is a sort of, how to say, the standard problem of classical architecture, is how to do the corners, because you have one system of orders from this side, and then all these four spaces meet in the crossing between the nave and the transept. And at the same time, they're supposed to support the dome on top. And when we compare various solutions to this problem throughout the Renaissance, we really see how this notion of syntax was really motivated by aesthetic concerns. So this is an early solution to this problem. We see these pillars with arches kind of crashing into this very big pilaster, and then on top of which the pendentive rests, this triangular part that makes a transition from a square room to the round, circular dome on top. So if we forward a little bit, we see that the use of the orders becomes a bit more elaborate, a bit more complex, both in the form of columns, but also in the form of pilasters like we see here. Superimposed orders, also kind of crashing into the major corner pillar. And in High Renaissance times, we see that this problem is tackled in a much more, let's say, refined, elegant way, using the orders more in combination with pilasters, with pillars, chamfering the corner, eventually leading to very elegant solutions. So this is the Baroque. And with regard to these theories of aesthetics from the Renaissance, this idea that buildings should somehow conform to higher conceptions of order and harmonic proportions, Baroque architects were much more concerned about visuality, how things look, the degree to which buildings please us immediately when we see them. And this quote by Guarini kind of says it all. He said that the sole aim of architecture is to please the senses, guided only by the approval of reasonable judgment and the judicious eye. So harmonic proportions are irrelevant in this. It's all about how you impress, so to speak, the beholder of the building. And at the same time, planning becomes extremely complex in these Baroque buildings. It's still a cruciform church, but everything is contorted, twisted and bent, still with the use of the classical orders like we see. But when we see one of the piers in isolation, it kind of looks like a mess almost. And we have to turn our gaze upwards to get the full picture of what's being done. And we get spaces like this, extremely complex, very overwhelming spaces. And I think one of the architects that really, let's say, summarized this tendency to experiment is Bernardo Vittone, the one I'm working on in my thesis, stating that the genius of the architect must be free, regardless of how astutely past architects conducted their work. One shouldn't believe that they achieved the best solutions in every respect. The source of invention is not closed for the moderns. So this idea that you restore Roman principles of architecture and then you just sort of, you mission complete and so on, that didn't happen at all. And the Baroque is a very interesting testimony of that. This is a building by Vittone where he Again, he plays with morphology. If we say that the pendentive is a sort of morphological element, he, instead of using a drum between the pendentive and the dome, he put the dome on piers, which enabled him to just hollow out and pierce the pendentive in a very elegant way. But this couldn't last forever. Like this experimentation, this playfulness, this disregard for sort of higher conceptions of aesthetics. So Neoclassicism is what we call the sort of break with Baroque, right? Starting in the middle of the 18th century. And it was sort of a resort back to a kind of essentialist theory of architectural aesthetics. But now, I mean, in the meantime, the scientific revolution happened, so it was not sort of like reintroducing harmonic proportions or anything like that. They had to find another essence or sort of narrative through which they would explain aesthetic properties. And that was the primitive hut. That's what we see here, the idea that classical architecture started as wooden post and lintel structures, which is plausible, of course. But for the architectural theorists that's quoted here, Marc-Antoine Laugier, he said the following: the little rustic cabin is the model upon which all the magnificences of architecture have been imagined. It's in the essential parts that all the beauties consist. In the part added thereto by caprice consist all the defects. So all the unnecessary whims of the architects is clearly sort of criticizing the Baroque here. All of that should be avoided. An architecture should manifest the primitive hut, the little rustic cabin that's sort of, it was considered the prototype of the classical orders. And then we get this classical architecture that is a bit more austere, a bit more schematic. We see that this playfulness with syntax, this sort of quest of finding new ways to combine columns and tablatures and so on is not really there anymore. And I think this is a very good example of that. If you compare, it's the same kind of space. It's a Greek cross plan. The one to the left is from the Baroque era. The one to the right is from the early 19th century. And on the left, we see that the orders are sort of what sort of the driving force in the spatial composition, not only in all the spaces that meet in the crossing, but also on the corners. Whereas here, we're kind of back to early Renaissance way of doing it by just putting one pilaster on the corner, and that's it. So the interesting thing here, I think, is that we can sort of see how these ideas about aesthetics, these ideas about beauty, also shape the way architects design. And with neoclassicism and tectonics, the idea that ornaments should represent the tectonic origin of themselves, like a column represents a post. Sorry, it's quite different from this very, let's say, formalist Baroque sensory aesthetics. And I want to end this with a quote that sort of criticizes this whole idea that architecture must be true to some sort of criteria, that in order to be beautiful, architecture must satisfy criteria, be it harmonic proportions or proportions of the human body or tectonic origin of the orders. So this is kind of the last breath of Baroque theory, right? Falsehood is more beautiful than truth. Obviously saying that truth is a sort of conceptual narrative that you through which you explain architectural beauty. So I think this is worth thinking about also in our time. There's a lot of debates when it comes to what beauty is, how to achieve it, and so on and so forth. So that was my talk. Thank you very much.